Phil here from Indirectly Tanked, and today I'm going to show you how I painted this Ultramarine for the Horus Heresy by Games Workshop. Let's get started. For the deep, rich cobalt blue of the Ultramarines armor, I start by applying a pretty general white zenithal highlight over a black undercoat, using Scale 75's white ink. This highlight will help to build the volumes on the Space Marine's armor and add more visual interest when we apply the blue in the next step. For the first layer of blue, I used Tesla Blue by Scale 75, thinned down and shot through my airbrush. I had to do 2 coats here because I originally thinned down the paint too much, but it's better to thin it too much here because I'd rather have the contrast of the previous zenithal highlights still show through than obliterate it by going on too thick at this stage. Next, I airbrush on a highlight of Caribbean Blue, also by Scale 75. This highlight is fairly general and should go anywhere that light would naturally catch the armor, such as the highest points on the shoulder pad, the crown of the helmet, or the tops of the knee. For the final highlight, I use a mix of 50-50 Caribbean Blue and White Sands by Scale 75. I prefer using White Sands here over pure white for this highlight because I found that pure white makes the color look too pastel or washed out, whereas White Sands still retains some warmth and adds more interest to the end result. At this point, the model is fairly pale and still needs a little more work to get the deep, rich cobalt we're looking for. It does, however, have really great volumes and interesting contrast that will show through the ink we're going to put on next. As you may have seen in my other videos, I am a huge proponent of using inks to get a nice, vibrant, and very saturated color. And for this Ultramarine, I'll be using Cyan ink by Scale 75, mixed about 50-50 ink to thinner. I start by applying this ink and thinner mixture over the entire model to tint the colors we put on before and really start bringing in that deep, rich blue we're looking for. After 2 all-over layers, I then start to apply this ink mix into the deepest shadows to really push the contrast even more. Finally, I spray multiple layers of thinned down gloss varnish over the entire model. This step is extremely important as the inks we just sprayed on are fairly thin and will actually rub off fairly easily if any moisture is applied to it. Next, I apply the decals to the shoulder and knee pads. I actually kind of messed up on one of the shoulder pads a little bit here, as the ink layer wasn't fully dry and the gloss varnish from the previous step didn't fully set. This resulted in the paint tearing a little bit and getting a splotchy and chipped texture on the right shoulder pad. Luckily, I am planning for this model to look very battle-worn and will be doing some sponge chipping later on. But this just goes to show why you really do need to make sure you have a layer of gloss varnish down when working with inks, such as this. Like on many of my models, I use sponge weathering on this Ultramarine to provide a little more character to the model, as well as to provide some definition to the armor plates without having to revert to edge highlighting. For the first layer of chipping, I use Rhinox Hide by Games Workshop. I also used chipping here to hide some of the paint tearing on the shoulder pads I got when I applied the transfers in the previous step. I next apply another layer of chipping with a mix of Tesla Blue and White Sands. Finally, I do a very light sponge chip of Thrash Metal by Scale 75. Next, I paint all the cabling and ribbing with Thrash Metal by Scale 75. I do this prior to the oil wash step so that the oils will shade the silver as well and save me from having to do another shade later on. I really enjoy using oil washes for my models because they add a ton of shade and depth to the model pretty quickly without a lot of finesse either. So instead of spending hours glazing in the perfect shadow, you can kind of slop on some oil paint, wipe it off, and have a pretty good looking model that's painted to a tabletop standard in no time at all. For this Ultramarine, I used a mix of lamp black oil paint by Winsor & Newton mixed with some odorless mineral spirits. I applied this wash very liberally and was not too worried about accidentally getting this where I don't want it to go, as I'll just wipe it off in the next step. Once the oil paint has fully dried, I next go back in with a makeup remover sponge and gently wipe away the oil where I don't want it to be. I really enjoy this process as there's no right or wrong way to do this step. Instead, you can remove as much or as little of the oil as you want with each pass of the sponge. And if you end up taking too much oil paint off, you can always go back to your original wash, add some more, let it dry, and repeat again. Finally, I give the whole model a spray of matte varnish by AK Interactive to kill the shine in the gloss varnish of the previous steps and give the model a nice matte finish. Because the matte varnish from the previous step dulled the silver down a bit, I next go back in with Thrash metal again and re-highlight all the silver parts. For the gold of the rims of the shoulder pads, I start by first putting down a layer of Decayed metal by scale 75, followed up by a layer of Dwarven gold, also by scale 75. The eye lenses were painted in a fairly standard way, in which I started off by painting them black, and then subsequently painted smaller and smaller areas of Deep Red, Antares Red, and Mars Orange by scale 75 in the lower corners of the eyes. Finally, I added a small dot of pure white to the top and bottom corners of the eye to represent light glinting off the glass. When I started playing Warhammer back in early 3rd edition, Ultramarines still had red bolt guns, and for me, that is the color their guns should always be. So for this model, I started by painting the bolt gun casing Deep Red by scale 75, and then gave it a layer of Agrax Earthshade by Games Workshop. Next, I painted on another layer of Deep Red, followed by edge highlights of a mix of Deep Red and Mars Orange, about 50-50. The bare metal areas of the gun were first painted with Thrash metal by scale 75, and then given a wash of 50-50 Druchii Violet and Nuln oil by Games Workshop. You can absolutely just use Nuln oil by itself for this step, but I really like the look that the Druchii Violet adds to the metallics. For the base, I used a worn flagstone base pattern that I created and cast up, and then sponged on various grays to get a nice worn stone look. I also added some clay weathering powder to the gaps between the stones to represent accumulated dirt and dust. All that's left now is to glue the model to the base, paint the edges of the base rim black, and add a few tufts of static grass between the flagstones. I am really happy with how this model turned out, and I think it encapsulates an Ultramarine fighting across Calth or the 500 worlds perfectly. If you found this video useful, please don't forget to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out. Also, if you have any thoughts on how I can improve these videos going forward, please leave a comment below, and I'd be happy to take your thoughts into consideration. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.